So here's a look at this building that I found in Kansas called the United Telephone Building. Now it's just basically you can just take tours of it, which I did, and I'll show you the inside, and we're gonna see some very, very, very strange symbolism inside of this building. And what they tell us is that it's Native American symbolism. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that and do a little bit job at explaining where these symbols come from and whether or not they are Native American. The answer is it's yes and no as far as Native American goes, because I believe we've not been told the truth about the Native Americans, who they are, how they lived, where they come from. And as I share my take on where they actually come from, who they actually are, that's gonna make these symbols make a lot more sense. And not just the symbols, but the architecture as a whole. Now, I definitely used the word Tartaria, Tartarian architecture, because it's a common word term given to this architecture that's old world stone masonry architecture that seems too heavy and too expert for the time period in which we're told they were built. But I personally am not a huge believer in the Tartarian civilization. I think that could very easily be just at some point in the past, maybe the controllers, the rulers, however you want to look at those people that are kind of controlling and lying about everything, they could have just said, yeah, here, we need to explain all this architecture everywhere. Here's a Tartarian stamp on it all. And who knows? Like it's really tough to say, but what we do know is this architecture is here and it's out of place. And these symbols is also going to show us who built these buildings. And so read this sign right here real fast, and then I'll show you just a little bit of the outside, and then we'll go inside and see the symbols on the building. So they call it the telephone building. They say in 1902, the telephone came to Goodland. Forgot to mention, we're in Goodland, Kansas. This is on the western side of Kansas, right as you're about to cross into not far from the Colorado border. Very cool city, actually. There's the people were really nice there. The guy that gave me a tour of this building was incredibly nice, and it was just an all-around fun, pleasant visit. So definitely recommend checking out Goodland, Kansas if you're in the area. So the telephone came to Goodland through the Goodland Telephone Company. It was a central system. And man, the more you study this stuff, the word united and the word central, when those words are used, that's like the rulers are the ones that like to use those types of words. It says that it was a central system, meant that an operator must be present to patch through calls. Over the years, the site of the company changed. In 1922, the stockholders sold their shares to the United Telephone Company. There's United and Central all in the same paragraph. By 1931, it says, more than 1,000 telephones were being used in the city, and a new building was proposed. The corner of 10th and Main Street became the location, and in 1931, the United Telephone Building was built. So that's when we're being told that this structure was built, was in 1931. Colby Hamilton, an employee from the telephone company, oversaw the design and decoration of the building. Odd. It's a very heavy stone masonry structure. It's expert masonry right here, and it's just some employee from the telephone company who was in charge of the design and the decoration of the building. I find that strange. And it says Native American symbols were used both inside and outside, with telephone poles painted to resemble totems used as the beams in the ceiling. I think this is all made up mostly. These symbols I do think come from where the Native Americans come from, which I'll explain in a second. But like they use telephone poles and painted them like Indians, like Native Americans, it sounds a bit silly to me. I think when America, the United States of America, the land was rediscovered in the 1500s, I think we have Native Americans living in big, nice stone cities. Not all of them. Maybe some of them were actually kind of more out in the wilderness, living on the land, teepees, that sort of a thing. But there's abundant evidence, and when you go back and study through history, it's there where these people and cities were already here, and the Native Americans were living in big stone cities. And we just have little pockets of those cities kind of remaining, and some of their symbols and designs still remaining. In 1937, the company merged with the Southwestern Bell, and in 1957, the mechanics of the telephones were removed. The building was owned by the county, but in 2017, it was given to the Sherman County Historical Society to rehouse the Parker Research Center. So Apparently it was a telephone company, and now it's just been passing through different government hands and agencies, more or less. Here's a look at the building from an angle. So we're kind of pointed towards the corner of the building right here, and you can see beautiful brick roads. And I visited quite a few cities when I was in Kansas, and there are several cities with brick roads, and they're very nice to drive on. And they're also quite old, maybe even older than we're told, but if we're going with the timelines that we've been told about them, you know, these are 100-year-old roads. And if you compare the quality of the road right here, it is way better than our roads nowadays. We lay our asphalt roads, and within the same week, they're already cracking and splitting. And then you got the guys coming out with tar just to fill in all the stuff and tar up the potholes. But these brick roads are in amazing condition, and they're not like super bumpy and annoying to drive on because they're real nice and level. So I'm a big fan of these brick roads in Kansas. They work very well and have worked very well for a very long time. Here's a look at the front of the building. You can see a bunch of brick laid down. And then if I zoom in on the building right here, you can see that there is new signage slapped on it that says telephone building, which is very cheap signage and very easy to take up or to put up and remove, take down whenever you want within a couple of seconds. But the rest of the design on the structure is not like that. It's integrated into the overall stonework of the structure, and it is very, very permanent. Now, it can be removed, that's possible, and on most of the buildings that we see, these colors and this stonework that's on these buildings has been and does get removed so that the buildings look much more dull. Like this picture right here, for example, we see some more of this intricate brickwork creating nice, pretty designs, but like on this building right here next to it, you can see that all of that has been stripped off. And that's the very most common story across all this architecture, across the whole country. It gets pillaged and stripped down to its bare bones, to where there's really nothing pretty left on it other than the coarse stonework. So it's pretty rare to see this telephone building. Here's another one that I found in the same city right here. And you can see it's been stripped down quite a bit, but at the top here, it still has some of its decoration and ornamentation. But a lot of these buildings have just been, they used to have a lot more on top of the buildings, towers, domes, steeples, stuff like that. But that gets stripped off, and then the design and the artwork on it also gets stripped off. So it's rare to see a building like this telephone building where you still have these beautiful colors and designs intact. And right here on the building, we see Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. Got the Bell system right here. A very interesting thing to consider. That company is also called the Bell system, and those of us who have looked into bells a little bit, oftentimes on this architecture there used to be bells attached to them, and the bells themselves are worth talking about because they're extremely heavy, and they sit most of the time in huge towers that are extremely heavy, just masterful stonemasonry. And they get pillaged and demolished and decommissioned. And this design right here, and we'll see this more on the inside, but this is a depiction of a sun shining. So you've got like the circle of the sun right here, and then you've got the beams shooting off of it, these kind of spiky things shooting off of it. Okay, now we go inside, and here's the design that's on the floor. And then I'll show you specifically the furniture inside of here is interesting. Like, I don't fully know what to make of it other than what I'll say about where I think the symbols come from, but let's take a look at these symbols on this furniture. We've seen that one before. We've definitely seen that one before. That doesn't seem like an American telephone company symbol. And this one right here, that's an Egyptian eagle. Doesn't seem like a telephone company symbol. And then also, if we look above the eagle, right here, these are sun rays or sunbeams, rays of sunshine shooting off right there, depicting the sun shining above the eagle. We'll talk a little bit more about these symbols in just a second, tell you what the eagle is, what the sun is, but very interesting. They said that this is original artwork from when the building was first built. Don't know what to say about that, whether that's true or not. I just think the symbols in here are mighty interesting. And then right here on the ceiling is where they say they put old telephone poles and painted them in Native American style. But it's like, even if that's true, like, what a strange thing to just basically wipe out a good chunk of the Native Americans and steal all of these old cities from them, and then go, oh yeah, no, we decided to build this building and, commemorate the Native Americans, and we put their symbols and their artwork all over it. It's like, that's either not true or it's extremely rude and evil to do something like that. You steal people's stuff and then you commemorate them by blasting their symbols all over your new building. That doesn't make sense. So Native Americans have a much more honest history that we're not really told about, and their cities that they were living in got stolen from them, and that's much of the stone masonry Tartarian architecture that we see is actually left over from the ancestors of the Native Americans. They're the ones who actually built this stuff. Then you got this bench over here, which is a very cool bench, and it's just the same thing again, where you've got that eagle. It's an Egyptian eagle sitting right there in the middle of it. If we look right here at the Nebraska Capitol building, at the very, very top of its tower, on the dome that's on top of the tower, we find this exact same eagle. It's an Egyptian eagle. And so it was the same thing with Nebraska Capitol building. Are we just putting random Native American symbols on top of huge stone towers on a huge copper dome that has a man standing on top of it that's fully made out of copper? That is called the sower. And he is a representation. He comes from the parable of the sower from the Bible, which is also where these other symbols come from. These are Jesus Christ religious Jewish/Christian symbols from ancient times, still sticking around to right now. And there's a book that talks about the Native Americans and their ancestors and the type of architecture that they built and where they come from. And this book describes that the ancestors of the Native Americans were Jewish and Egyptian styled people, and they were actually masterful architects. And the book explains the type of materials they used and the type of architecture that they built with those materials, and it's an exact match for all of this stonework and all of these symbols and all of the materials used on these buildings. And the introduction of this book that I'm talking about right here, it says this is a record of the ancient inhabitants of the Americas, which is the ancestors of the Native Americans. And if you look at this verse right here, it talks about some of the materials that they used to build their architecture. And it says they had machinery, gold, silver, copper, brass, iron, they had all that. And then they also had machinery. So there's a nice description of some of these same materials we find on all of these buildings, and a description that's also saying the people that build these buildings had machinery, which we're all looking at these and going, yeah, how did they build this? What's the magic behind it? There's no magic. There's just like we do now to move heavy stuff around. You got to have real ways to transport that weight around. And that's what they had back then, machinery. And this book that I'm referring to is a book that we've almost all heard of, but we've kind of been programmed to stay away from it. And this is part of the reason why, because it explains a lot of things about this land that we now call the United States of America, and the Native Americans that were native to this land previously, and where they come from, who they are, and the type of cities that they used to build. And this book is called the Book of Mormon. Yes, the Book of Mormon. I realize that's going to sound a bit strange to some of you because you think the Book of Mormon talks about all the weird stuff, multiple wives and all that you've heard about the Mormons, but the Book of Mormon doesn't talk about that stuff. Well, it actually says no to having multiple wives and all of that, which is interesting. So I'm just going to say, evaluate the book for what it says. Don't evaluate the book by all these other rumors and everything you've heard about it, because when I've read this book and I look at this architecture, it's an exact match. And all over this architecture across the whole country is Egyptian symbolism. And when you look at the very second verse of the Book of Mormon, it says these were Jewish and Egyptian styled people. And it says, like this verse right here, they became exceedingly industrious. They built mighty cities, and they were extremely populous, and they built cities and villages in all quarters of the land, which is what we see. Ancient stone masonry, Egyptian style architecture sitting all over the place in these lands. And oftentimes as part of it, like we're seeing right here, there's this whole, we're playing off of Native American stuff. You're not playing off of it, you're lying about it, because you're lying about the Native Americans, who they are, where they come from, and that this is actually their architecture from ancient times. Specifically, I would even say a huge chunk of it is coming from closer to 400 AD, but they were building a lot of stuff prior to that. And even when the Native Americans got to these lands, they already found big cities that were empty. So there was already empty architecture, stone architecture, sitting in these lands when they got here. And the Book of Mormon actually explains that the Native Americans, their ancestors, originally left Jerusalem and came to these lands, and they were a God-believing people, a Jesus Christ-believing people. Prior to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, they practiced and lived the law of Moses. But then once Jesus Christ was born and resurrected, then they stopped keeping the law of Moses and they started living the New Testament, the new law of Christ. And that's why all this symbolism is Native American symbolism / religious symbolism, specifically Jewish and Christian Egyptian symbolism, because that's where the people that built it came from, and that's what they worshipped was God, and these are his symbols. Like the eagle right here, the same eagle that we find on the tower and the dome on the Nebraska Capitol building, it's an Egyptian eagle. And when you read the Old Testament, God says, I escaped the Israelites out of Egypt and brought them to myself in the promised land on eagle's wings. The eagle is the symbol of God escaping the Israelites out of Egypt and bringing them to the promised land, which is the land that we now call United States of America, which is why the eagle is the symbol of these lands. And then we always see the sun shining. Like I said, right here, you got beams of sunshine above the eagle, and on the exterior of the building, you've got that sun depicted. And the reason for that is because God is the light and life of the world. He's the one that on eagle's wings escapes the Israelites out of Egypt and brings them to himself in the promised land. So you have the sun, God, shining above and behind the eagle. And the eagle is the symbol of God bringing his covenant people, the seed of Abraham, the Israelites, to him in the promised land. Because that's the pattern in the Old Testament. God made this covenant with Abraham and all of his seed that they'll get the promised land for forever. In the Old Testament, they're constantly being taken back to the promised land and given another shot to live correctly in that location. And if they don't, they get wiped out and the land gets given to somebody else, which is what happened to the Native Americans and their ancestors, because they stopped following God and Jesus as they were supposed to, and so their lands got given away to different people. And that's what we're analyzing right here, is the people that conquered, that got given away to, they kind of joke around about stuff and they lie about stuff and they're deceitful about things and they don't tell us the real truth and the real stories. But the Book of Mormon does lay it out very precisely and explains where these people come from and what they built and what style and materials they used to build their architecture and their cities. And it's an exact match for everything we're looking at in this Tartarian architecture. So if you want to read a book that tells the most honest version of these lands, the people in these lands, and the architecture and the cities that they built, and why they got wiped out, and why their lands got given away and their cities got given away, taken away, read the Book of Mormon. It does a great job at explaining all of that. That's literally in the introduction of the Book of Mormon. It says, this is a record of the ancient inhabitants of the Americas. That's what the book's about. It's not about all the weird stuff you've heard about the Mormons. So give it a shot. If you're genuinely, sincerely, your intent is really just to seek truth and you're curious about where this stuff comes from, that's a book that has to be part of your analysis. It's heavily, heavily integrated with early American history. And also, like I've already just explained and pulled up some verses showing you that it's an exact match for all this architecture. That is stonemasonry, Egyptian style architecture with Jesus Christ symbolism all over it. And the Book of Mormon is another testament of Jesus Christ. It's telling the story of the ancient inhabitants of the Americas and their relationship or lack thereof with the Creator, God, Jesus Christ.